A vampire who can never touch, falling in love with a girl he can never truly hold. How far will he go to break his curse and be with her? Aidan's world of shadows is about to collide with the light of something he thought he could never have, true human connection. But breaking a curse has a price, and it could cost him everything. In the farthest corners of the ancient world, where the boundaries between life and death were thin, there existed a vampire. He was known by many names over the centuries, but most commonly, he was referred to as Aidan. His story began long before the mortal world had even begun to count its years. Yet, in all his existence, there had never been a curse more excruciating than the one he carried, a curse that kept him from ever touching another living being. He was alone, surrounded by the vastness of time. The world had grown indifferent to him, a shadow in the dark corners of forgotten lands. Despite his vast power, his immortality, and the incredible abilities he held as a vampire, Aidan found himself cursed by a singular, unbearable limitation: he could not touch. No hand could rest on his shoulder. No warmth could be felt from an embrace. He could not even share a simple touch of affection with another being, and the absence of this human need weighed heavily on him. Over time, Aidan came to understand the cruel nature of his curse. It was not just the lack of touch, it was the feeling of being permanently cut off from the rest of humanity, a being living among mortals yet unable to interact in the simplest of ways. The inability to touch had slowly eroded the essence of what it meant to live in the world. He could not make connections, could not share experiences, and as centuries passed, he learned that nothing felt more isolating than this simple yet profound lack. It was a consequence of the magic that had been wrought upon him centuries ago, when a witch, angered by his actions, cast the spell that would haunt him for eternity. The curse was meant to make him feel the weight of his wrongdoings, to make him understand the value of every life he had taken. She wanted to isolate him from everything, to take away his ability to connect with the world, and she succeeded. His immortality had kept him alive through ages, watching as civilizations rose and fell, witnessing the fleeting nature of life. But with each passing century, the pain of his curse grew. He saw people, mere mortals, live their lives, meet others, love, and connect in ways that he could only dream of. As much as he tried to mask his feelings, his heart would ache every time he saw a family share a moment of warmth or a couple embrace each other under the pale moonlight. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Aidan found himself walking through the streets of a quiet town, one of many that had sprouted over the centuries in the places he had once known. His presence was unnoticed by the mortals, a shadow among them. He had learned to exist in the background, never allowing himself to be seen. His existence was that of a ghost, half in the world but not part of it. However, that night, something was different. As he walked past the familiar houses, his gaze fell upon a figure, a girl sitting on the edge of a garden bench. She appeared to be alone, lost in thought, her eyes gazing up at the stars, as though she was waiting for something. There was something about her that caught Aidan's attention. She was not just any mortal, there was a depth in her eyes, a softness in her expression, something that felt familiar. He had seen many faces throughout his endless years, many beautiful, many full of life, but there was something about her, something that made his ancient heart stir in ways it hadn't in centuries. It was strange, this feeling of attraction, something he had not experienced since he was human. He had been so accustomed to solitude, to watching others from afar, that he had forgotten what it was like to feel something as basic as desire. Yet, as he watched the girl, he felt it, intensely. But as quickly as the feeling rose, it was crushed under the weight of his curse. He could never touch her. He could never approach her as a man would approach a woman. She would never feel the warmth of his embrace, never know the comfort of his presence. He was a being who could never physically connect with anyone, and this fact stung more sharply in that moment than ever before. Days passed, and Aidan found himself unable to stop thinking about the girl. Each time he wandered through the streets, his eyes would inevitably seek her out. He watched from the shadows as she walked through town, smiling at friends, laughing with her family, living a life he could only envy. Her name, he learned, was Elena. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark, flowing hair that shimmered under the sunlight, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. Her smile was gentle, but there was a quiet sadness in her expression, a depth to her that suggested she was no stranger to hardship. He was drawn to her, not because of any specific physical trait, but because of the way she carried herself. There was an unspoken grace in her movements, a quiet strength that reminded him of the woman he had once been. In his younger years, Aidan had been much like her, alive, hopeful, and full of dreams. But now, he was far removed from that version of himself, a hollow shell of a man whose only purpose was to exist. But even as his desire to know her grew, Aidan remained a spectator in her life. He dared not get too close, for the curse that bound him was absolute. He could not touch her, could not hold her hand or even brush his fingers against hers. And though his heart longed for her, the truth remained, she could never be his. Still, Aidan could not let go. He found himself haunting the corners of her life, watching her with a mixture of longing and sorrow. Elena, for her part, seemed unaware of his gaze. She went about her life, unaware of the vampire who silently observed her from the shadows. Time passed, and the vampire found himself wrestling with an inner turmoil. He had always prided himself on his detachment, on the way he had learned to distance himself from the world. But Elena's presence made him question everything he had once believed. He realized that, despite all the power and immortality he possessed, there was one thing he truly desired, the one thing he could never have, her. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Aidan found himself consumed by thoughts of Elena. She had become the center of his existence, though she remained unaware of his presence. He walked the streets of the town every night, as was his habit, though he now lingered near her home longer than before. He would watch her from a distance, as she went about her daily routine, sipping coffee in the morning sunlight, tending to her small garden, laughing with friends at the local market. All of it was normal, mundane even, but for Aidan, it felt like the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. There was an ache inside him, a deep, unrelenting ache. Each time Elena would laugh, or her eyes would meet another's with affection, he would feel a pang in his chest. He yearned for the simple connection that mortals took for granted, a connection he could never have. He wanted nothing more than to sit beside her, to place a hand on her shoulder, to hear her voice closer, to be part of her world. Yet, each time he came near her, he was reminded of the bitter truth, he could never touch her. She would never know the warmth of his presence in a way that would matter to her. It wasn't just the curse that tortured him. It was the isolation that came with it, the endless separation from the world, from those who could share in human experiences. He could observe, but he could never be part of the life he witnessed. The pain was unbearable at times, but Aidan had long since learned to keep his suffering locked away, hidden deep inside him. He had mastered the art of silence, of controlling the emotions that could break him. He was a vampire after all, an immortal being who had lived through centuries of turmoil, tragedy, and loss. But nothing had prepared him for this. Elena, with her soft, inviting smile and her quiet resilience, had stirred something in him he had not felt in centuries, something real. But it was an emotion that only deepened his despair. How could he have fallen for someone he could never touch? How could he allow himself to care for a woman when the very nature of his existence condemned him to remain a shadow in her life, a ghost of something that could never be? In moments of solitude, he found himself reflecting on his past, the time before the curse, when he was still human, when his hands were warm, his touch comforting. He had once loved deeply, fiercely even, but that was before everything changed. The vampire in him had died long ago, but the man remained, trapped in a body that could not feel, in a heart that could no longer love. He could remember the feel of a lover's hand in his, the softness of a cheek pressed against his chest, the warmth of breath against his skin. He had been so full of life then, so full of possibilities. But with his immortality came an insurmountable price. The curse had robbed him of those small but significant things, the touch of another, the physical connection that made one feel truly alive. The curse had rendered him a prisoner of his own desires, a being who could witness love but never experience it. Elena had no idea of his inner torment. She went about her life, smiling, living, growing. He watched her with a strange mixture of awe and regret. Sometimes, when she would smile at someone, Aidan would imagine what it might feel like to have her smile directed at him. Would she look at him the same way? Would the warmth of her affection melt the coldness that had taken root in his heart? But that was the problem, wasn't it? He could never ask her. He could never allow himself to cross the invisible line that separated them. To approach her would be to remind her of his curse, of the unnaturalness of his existence. He would never be able to share with her the simple joy of a touch, of holding hands or wrapping his arms around her when she needed comfort. He was trapped in this silent longing, forced to remain a silent observer. Aidan knew that his presence in her life was nothing but a shadow, a fleeting moment that would never be enough to change the course of her world. But still, he could not let go. Each night, he would return to the same spot, watching from a distance as Elena lived her life, seemingly unaware of the silent watcher in the shadows. He had tried to distance himself, to walk away from her life. But each time he tried, it felt like something vital was slipping through his fingers. He had never known true loneliness until now, never understood how desperately he longed for a connection that he could never have. There were times when the pain of it all threatened to crush him, and yet, he could not bring himself to leave her. Perhaps it was the very fact that he could never touch her that made him want her more. He had always been drawn to what was out of his reach. As the months wore on, Aidan grew more restless, more consumed by his need for Elena. His desire for her was no longer just a passing thought, it had become a gnawing hunger, something he could not ignore. He began to dream of her at night, dreams that were filled with moments of closeness, of standing beside her, of feeling the warmth of her body close to his, of the simple act of holding her in his arms. These dreams would always end in a cruel, bitter awakening, the knowledge that they could never be more than dreams hanging heavy on his heart. One evening, as he stood in his usual place across the street from her home, watching her prepare for the night, something shifted within him. Elena looked up, her eyes scanning the street as though she felt a presence. Aidan froze, a wave of panic surging through him. Could she sense him? Could she feel the weight of his gaze on her? For a moment, their eyes locked, and Aidan felt something stir within him, an overwhelming urge to step forward, to close the distance between them. But he didn't. He couldn't. He remained motionless, watching her as she turned back to her house, completely unaware of the vampire who watched from the shadows. Aidan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He had not been seen, not truly. But the brief moment of connection, the fleeting instant when their eyes met, had shaken him to his core. He felt something stir in him, a spark of hope. A foolish hope that perhaps, in some way, there could be more to their story. But no matter how hard he tried to fight it, Aidan knew deep down that this hope would always remain unfulfilled. For the girl he had fallen for would never know his touch. And in the end, that was the cruelest irony of all. Aidan found himself in an emotional tempest. The curse, that ancient affliction that had isolated him for centuries, now gnawed at him with a ferocity he had never before experienced. It was not just the inability to touch Elena, it was the raw ache of seeing her and knowing that he could never truly be a part of her world. He had been a part of many worlds over the ages, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the birth of new civilizations, but none had stirred him as profoundly as this mortal girl. She had unknowingly penetrated the wall he had built around himself, a wall forged by years of solitude, regret, and bitterness. Every night, he would return to his corner, silently watching her, waiting for a glimpse of her laugh, her smile, the way she moved through life. She was unaware of the vampire in the shadows, but Aidan knew everything about her. He knew her routine, the way she walked to the market every Wednesday morning, the way she always stopped to help an elderly neighbor carry their groceries, the way she sat in her garden in the evenings, staring up at the stars as though lost in thought. But it was the way she carried herself that truly captivated him, the quiet strength in her, the tenderness in her actions. It made him ache in ways he had never imagined. He had seen many faces over the centuries, countless beautiful women, but none had made him feel as Elena did. None had made him feel the stirrings of longing that burned in his chest, that haunted his every thought. The curse that had once seemed like a mere inconvenience now felt like a prison. Aidan had always prided himself on his ability to endure, to live through centuries without letting emotions sway him. But Elena, with her light and warmth, had shattered that detachment. He had allowed himself to hope, just for a moment, that perhaps there could be a way to break the curse, to find some form of connection with her. But deep down, he knew it was impossible. The curse was absolute, a part of him now, a part of his very essence. It was in his nature to distance himself, to remain an observer rather than a participant. He had learned long ago that getting too close to others was dangerous. Attachment only led to pain. He had seen that firsthand with those he had once loved. Immortality had come with a price, and that price was the endless cycle of loss. Aidan had watched loved ones grow old and die while he remained unchanged, a constant in a world that was forever shifting. The pain of that loss had been unbearable at times, and it was easier, safer, to remain distant. He had convinced himself that this was the only way to survive, by existing without attachment, without desire. But Elena had changed all of that. Every time he saw her, every time he watched her smile or laugh, the walls he had built around himself cracked just a little more. His heart, long since hardened by centuries of solitude, began to beat again, softly, weakly, but with undeniable force. He felt the stirrings of something deep within him, something long buried and forgotten. It was a terrifying feeling. He had learned to live without the need for human connection, but now, with Elena, that need was undeniable. He could no longer ignore it. One night, after a particularly hard day spent watching her from afar, Aidan found himself standing in the moonlight, staring up at the sky. The stars above seemed so distant, so unattainable, much like Elena herself. He wondered what it would be like to hold her hand, to feel the warmth of her skin against his. The thought was maddening. He wanted nothing more than to reach out, to close the distance between them, but he knew he could never do it. The curse had made sure of that. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the depth of his desire. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual even. He wanted to share a life with her, to experience the simple joys of being human again. He wanted to be part of something, to feel the connection he had been denied for so long. But the cruel truth remained, he could never have that with her. She could never know the love he had to offer, never experience the intimacy that he so desperately craved. And so, he would remain a distant figure in her life, a shadow on the periphery of her existence. As the days went by, Aidan found himself growing restless. He could no longer bear to simply watch from the shadows. He needed to be closer to her, even if it meant enduring the unbearable pain of being near her but never truly connecting. It was as though the ache inside him had become a living, breathing thing, demanding to be acknowledged. He had always kept his emotions tightly controlled, never allowing himself to feel too much. But with Elena, everything was different. It was during one of these restless nights that Aidan made the decision to get closer to her. He knew it was foolish, that he was putting himself in a dangerous position, but he could no longer stay away. He had to know her better, even if he could never truly have her. The thought of being near her, of seeing her up close, was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. But he couldn't resist. He took to walking the streets at night, closer now than ever before. He found himself lingering near her house, watching her through her windows as she went about her evening routines. Sometimes, he would watch as she sat on the porch, reading a book or sipping tea. She seemed so content, so peaceful in her little world, and Aidan felt both comforted and tortured by her presence. He wanted to step forward, to speak to her, but the curse held him back. The invisible barrier between them was too strong, too painful. On one particular night, as he stood in the shadows, watching her laugh with a friend on her porch, he felt a strange pull inside him. It was as though the world itself was urging him forward, telling him to take the step he had been avoiding. But just as quickly as the impulse came, it was gone, replaced by the familiar coldness of reality. He couldn't do it. He could never do it. And so, he remained in the shadows, silently watching, silently yearning, unable to break free from the invisible chains that bound him. The more he observed her, the more he realized that his curse was not just a physical limitation, it was a spiritual one. It had changed him, made him something other than human. The vampire he had become was forever separated from the world he once knew. And no matter how much he longed for Elena, he could never cross that line. He had been cursed to live this way, to watch others live their lives while he remained a prisoner of his own desires. And in the silence of the night, as he watched Elena from afar, Aidan wondered if he would ever truly escape the chains that bound him, or if he would be forever condemned to this silent longing. The more Aidan observed Elena, the more he realized how deeply intertwined his longing had become with his very existence. Every movement she made seemed to echo in his mind, every laugh she shared with someone else cut through him like a blade. The curse that kept him from touching anyone, especially her, had become a constant weight, one that pressed against his chest like a vice. At first, he had tried to push the feelings away, to bury them beneath the ice-cold exterior that had defined him for centuries. But the longer he watched her, the harder it became to ignore the warmth that had begun to grow within him. The gap between his internal yearning and his external restraint grew wider every day. He would watch her, helplessly, knowing that no matter what he wanted, no matter how intensely he desired her, he would never be able to express it. No touch, no embrace, no kiss. And that thought, the thought that he could never touch her, made everything else feel pointless. What was the point of feeling alive if he could never truly connect with another person? What was the point of being immortal if he couldn't experience the simple pleasures of life, those fleeting moments of human connection that meant so much to the living? Aidan had been living for centuries, surviving on the edge of existence, never truly part of the world around him. He had witnessed countless moments of love, pain, and joy, but they were all just stories to him, passing by as quickly as the seasons changed. He had never allowed himself to get involved. He had told himself that it was better this way, that the more distance he kept, the less it would hurt when everything inevitably ended. But with Elena, everything was different. He no longer cared about the distance between him and the rest of the world. The only thing that mattered now was the ache in his chest whenever he saw her smile, or when he caught a glimpse of her soft gaze as she passed by. He needed to be close to her, even if it could never go beyond the boundary of his curse. The curse that had rendered him touchless. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky, bathing the town in silver light, Aidan found himself standing outside her window once more, watching her as she sat by the fire, the glow of the flames dancing in her eyes. There was something so serene about her in that moment, something that made his heart ache with a longing that was almost unbearable. He stood there for hours, lost in the sight of her, unsure if he was even breathing. He could not tear his eyes away from her. And then, for the briefest moment, something happened, something that both terrified and exhilarated him. Elena stood up from her seat by the fire, and, without warning, turned to look out the window, directly in his direction. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Aidan felt a rush of heat flood his chest. It was as though she had known he was there, felt his presence like a whisper on the wind. She stared at him for what felt like an eternity, and Aidan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. In that moment, Aidan could not resist. The urge to move closer, to speak to her, was overwhelming. He took a step forward, drawn to her like a magnet. But just as quickly, the realization hit him, he could not touch her. He could never be more than a fleeting presence in her life, a shadow in the night. His steps faltered, and the weight of his curse hit him like a tidal wave. He pulled back, retreating into the darkness, leaving her behind, once again. Elena had no idea that he had been so close, so near to stepping into her life. Aidan hated the distance between them, the invisible barrier that kept them apart. He hated how she seemed to sense him, but he could never truly reach her. 4 days after that night, Aidan found himself torn. The look in Elena's eyes, the brief connection they had shared, had haunted him. He had come so close to breaking the curse, to crossing the boundary between them, even if only for a moment. But he had pulled away, just as he always did. He was afraid. Afraid that the truth of his curse would shatter the illusion of connection he had with her. Afraid that if she knew who he truly was, she would never look at him the same way again. The fear of rejection, of seeing the look of horror in her eyes when she realized that he could never touch her, had been too much for him to bear. And so, he had retreated into the shadows, once again. He could never let her know. He could never allow her to touch the parts of him that were so deeply buried beneath the surface. The truth of his curse was a thing too painful, too cruel to share. It was something that kept him trapped in his own solitude, unable to move forward. And yet, despite his fears, despite the overwhelming agony of knowing that his touch would always remain beyond her reach, Aidan couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. He couldn't touch her, he knew that. But there had to be some way to bridge the gap between them. He had to find it. The thought consumed him, gnawing at him day and night, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. As the days turned into weeks, Aidan began to find himself slipping further into the desperate longing that consumed him. He found himself standing by her window more often, watching her as she lived her life, always just out of reach. And each time he stood there, his desire grew stronger, more insistent. The need to touch her, to be close to her, to feel her presence against his, was overwhelming. It was a hunger that he could no longer ignore. But still, he remained helpless. The curse was too strong, the barrier too high. He could never touch her, and that reality was a constant, painful reminder of the life he had been condemned to. He was a prisoner of his own desires, trapped in a world where the one thing he wanted most was the one thing he could never have. And yet, as the days wore on, Aidan began to realize something else. Elena had become his obsession, his reason for existing. In a world that had long since lost its meaning for him, she had become the one thing that mattered. He had no future, no past, only her. And no matter how painful it was, no matter how impossible it seemed, he would never be able to let her go. Aidan was beginning to understand that, perhaps, it was not the touch that mattered most. It was the connection. It was the ability to exist in the same space, to share the same moments, even if they were separated by an invisible divide. Perhaps, even without the ability to touch, there could still be a way forward. It would be painful, excruciating even, but it might be enough. And so, as he stood there in the shadows, watching Elena once more, Aidan made a choice. He would no longer stand on the outside, waiting. He would find a way to break the curse. Not for the promise of physical touch, but for the possibility of something more, a connection that could transcend the limitations of his curse. He would find a way to be with her, even if it meant enduring the greatest pain of all. As the days passed, Aidan's resolve deepened. The more he thought about Elena, the more he felt an undeniable pull toward her, a pull that he could no longer ignore. The curse that kept him from touching her had, for too long, been the boundary he could never cross. But now, with his heart full of a longing that no amount of time or distance could erase, he knew that he had to find a way to change that, to bridge the unbridgeable gap between them. Aidan had lived centuries with the understanding that his curse was absolute, a part of him that could never be altered. He had accepted that isolation, that eternal separation from the rest of the world, as an unchangeable truth. It had been his reality for so long that it had become almost like a second skin, something he wore and accepted without question. But Elena had shown him something he had long forgotten, the deep, undeniable need for human connection, the need to feel not just seen, but truly known. It was a feeling he had abandoned long ago, convinced that love and affection were fleeting emotions that only led to pain. He had witnessed so much loss over the centuries, and the sharp sting of rejection had become something he had learned to live with. But Elena was different. She had awoken something within him, a desire that burned so fiercely it made him feel more alive than he had in centuries. The thought that he could never hold her, never touch her, seemed impossible to bear. But as his desire for her grew, so did his understanding of the true nature of his curse. The more he looked at her, the more he realized that this wasn't just about touch, it was about more than simply feeling her warmth against him. It was about connection, about sharing something meaningful. And that, perhaps, was the hardest thing of all. For Aidan knew that even if he could break the curse, even if he could touch her, the act of simply touching would never be enough. True connection required more than physical closeness, it required an openness, an emotional intimacy that he was unsure he could offer. How could he open himself to someone else when his very nature was one of secrecy, of distance? His immortal life had been built on walls, emotional, psychological, and physical, and those walls had been the only things that had kept him from losing himself to the loneliness that had defined his existence. How could he tear those walls down for a woman who had no idea what he truly was? Yet, there was no escaping the fact that the more he observed Elena, the more he yearned to be near her. He began to find himself lingering in places he had never dared to before, standing near the edge of her garden, just outside her window, watching her as she moved about her life. Each time she passed by, a strange sense of longing overtook him, and each time, the weight of his curse felt unbearable. The thought of her laughing with her friends, of her touching someone else, filled him with a strange mix of longing and bitterness. He wanted to be the one she laughed with, the one she turned to for comfort, but he was cursed to remain nothing more than a shadow in her life. One evening, as Aidan stood in the shadows of the trees near her home, watching her move about the garden, he realized something crucial. His curse was not simply an inability to touch, it was an inability to be truly present in her life. He had no place in her world, no role that would allow him to be a part of her story. He was the eternal outsider, always watching, always yearning, but never truly participating. That, more than anything else, was what tore him apart. And yet, he could not walk away. The more he tried to convince himself to leave, the more he found himself drawn back to her. The thought of leaving, of severing the connection that had begun to form between them, however tenuous, felt impossible. He had allowed himself to care, and now, he could not imagine a world without her in it. The pain of his desire, his longing to touch her, to hold her, to be with her, had become too much to bear. His hunger for her was no longer just a physical need, it had become something deeper, something more profound. He wanted her not just for the brief moments of connection they could share, but for the possibility of something more. The simple act of holding her, of touching her, felt like the ultimate form of salvation, a way to escape the cold, distant existence he had known for so long. But even as his longing grew, so did his fear. The curse that bound him to his immortal existence was not something easily broken. He had tried before, in countless ways, but every attempt had ended in failure. He had watched as others had tried to break the chains of their own limitations, only to be consumed by the very thing they sought to overcome. Could he, too, fall victim to that same fate? The risk was enormous. If he allowed himself to truly feel for Elena, to truly connect with her, there was a chance that his curse would deepen, that he would be forever bound to the very thing he sought to escape. It was a price he was unwilling to pay. Or was it? In the stillness of the night, as the moon hung high above, Aidan made a decision. He would try. He would attempt to break the curse, not for the promise of touch, but for the chance to be closer to her. He would seek out whatever magic, whatever knowledge, might allow him to cross the boundaries that separated them. The search would be long, and the cost would be high. He would need to confront the dark, painful truths of his existence, the very things he had buried deep within himself for centuries. But if it meant he could be with her, even if only for a brief moment, it would be worth it. Aidan could feel the pull of Elena in every fiber of his being. He could not ignore it any longer. The curse that had once seemed like an insurmountable wall now felt like a challenge, a final test of his will. And this time, he would not walk away. He would fight, even if the fight meant confronting the very nature of what he was. The journey ahead would be fraught with dangers, not just physical but emotional as well. But Aidan was ready. For the first time in centuries, he was ready to fight for something. For her. The days that followed Aidan's decision to confront his curse were filled with a restless urgency he hadn't felt in centuries. The deep longing for Elena, no longer just a passing desire, but a burning ache, drove him forward. He could no longer live in the shadows, could no longer stand by while his heart slowly crumbled with every passing moment of separation. There was a recklessness in his soul now, a determination that he hadn't experienced since his mortal life. For the first time in centuries, Aidan felt truly alive. He began his search for a way to break the curse, a quest that was as much about unraveling the mystery of his own nature as it was about seeking out a way to reach Elena. The vampire world, with its ancient magics, its hidden knowledge, had secrets buried deep within it. Some of these secrets had been forgotten by even the oldest of his kind, powerful spells, long-lost rituals that might offer him a way to touch her, to break the wall that had stood between them for so long. But every step he took led him deeper into a labyrinth of shadowy figures, cryptic prophecies, and forgotten curses. The vampire world, with its long history of blood and betrayal, was not a place of clarity or kindness. There were those who reveled in the suffering of others, who would use his desire against him, and who would demand payment for even the smallest hint of knowledge. Aidan found himself caught in a web of ancient magic, its threads pulling him further away from what he wanted. And as he dug deeper, he realized that the cost of breaking his curse was something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The first piece of the puzzle came in the form of an old witch, hidden away in a forgotten corner of the world, a being as ancient as the curse itself. She spoke to Aidan in riddles, her voice like the wind through dry leaves. She warned him that breaking his curse would not be easy, that it would require him to sacrifice something precious, something irreplaceable. She told him that to gain the power to touch another, he would need to give up the very thing that made him who he was, his immortality. Aidan listened, silent, absorbing her words with a cold, rational mind. He had known that there would be a price, but the weight of her words lingered in his mind. The very thing that had allowed him to survive for centuries, his immortality, was also the very thing that kept him from ever experiencing true connection. It was a double-edged sword, a curse in itself. She had made it clear, if he chose to break the curse, if he chose to reclaim the ability to touch, to love, he would no longer be the immortal vampire he had been. He would become mortal, just like the humans he had watched for so long, and the life he had lived for centuries would come to an end. It was a decision that struck him deeply. He had been an immortal being for as long as he could remember. To give up his immortality was to give up everything he had known, his eternal existence, the vast knowledge he had accumulated over the centuries, the power that set him apart from others. To choose mortality meant stepping into the unknown, a world where death was a certainty, where everything he had built, everything he had become, would be lost. But even as the weight of the decision settled over him, Aidan found that he could not turn back. The curse had left him so hollow, so empty, that the thought of continuing his existence without ever feeling the touch of another, without ever feeling Elena's warmth against him, seemed unbearable. The idea of being free from the curse, of being able to experience life fully once more, was a temptation that overshadowed everything else. He was tired of existing in the shadows, of watching the world pass by without being a part of it. He wanted to live, to feel, to connect. Aidan made his choice. He would find a way to break the curse, no matter the cost. The witch provided him with a ritual, a dangerous one that required a unique sacrifice, an object tied to his soul. It would be the key to unlocking the magic that would finally break his curse. But she did not warn him of the pain, of the emotional destruction it would cause. The sacrifice would not just be a physical one, it would be a loss of his very essence. His connection to the immortal world, his place among the ancient beings he had once called family, would be severed. He would become mortal, a fleeting creature like the humans he had watched for so long. But Aidan no longer cared. For the first time in centuries, he longed to feel what they felt, to experience the beauty and the fragility of life. He knew that the cost would be great, but it was a price he was willing to pay. The curse had taken enough from him. It was time for him to take back what he had lost. The night of the ritual arrived, and Aidan stood alone in the dark, ancient woods, the air thick with the scent of earth and magic. The witch had given him the instructions, but the power to break the curse lay within him, within the very core of his being. He stood in the center of the clearing, the ritual circle drawn around him in intricate patterns, symbols of power that had been passed down through generations of dark magic. As he began the incantation, he could feel the magic stir within him, a tremor of power that threatened to consume him. The energy crackled in the air, a force so ancient and dangerous that Aidan could almost taste it on his tongue. But even as the magic swirled around him, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The price of breaking his curse was not just a physical sacrifice, it was the sacrifice of everything he had known. The centuries of power, the knowledge he had accumulated, the eternal existence that had once been his, he would lose it all. But as the ritual reached its climax, a surge of magic enveloped him, and Aidan felt something stir within him, something he had not felt in centuries. It was warmth, a lightness, a feeling of connection that he had longed for. The magic had taken everything, but it had also given him something he had never expected, the ability to touch. His curse was broken. The pain of the ritual hit him like a wave, and Aidan fell to his knees in the center of the clearing. His body felt different and fragile, mortal. The magic had changed him, stripped away the layers of immortality that had protected him for so long. The world seemed different now, less distant. His senses were sharper, more alive, and for the first time in centuries, he felt the weight of time, the fleeting nature of life. But as he rose to his feet, Aidan knew that he had done it. He had broken the curse. He could finally feel, finally touch, and finally experience the connection he had craved. The price had been steep, but it was a price he had paid willingly. The life he had known was gone, but in its place, he had something more precious than immortality, the ability to love. And so, with the knowledge that his eternity had been forever altered, Aidan made his way back to the town, to the girl who had changed everything. Elena would never know the true cost of his decision, but she would know the love he had for her. He would be there, in her world, not as a distant figure in the shadows, but as someone who could truly touch her, who could hold her, who could share in her life. The curse was broken, and with it, the life he had known. But in return, Aidan had found something even more powerful than immortality. He had found the possibility of love, of connection, of touch. And for the first time in centuries, he felt truly alive.